Hello and thanks for tuning in for this edition of Stratfor Talks, the monthly podcast where we give you a behind-the-scenes look at some of our analysis and global affairs. I'm Ben Sheen.
And I'm Marla Moore.
And we're your hosts for this show.
Our show today is divided into two segments. First, military analyst Paul Floyd will be with us to discuss both the tactical and structural challenges that American and British military trainers are facing in Iraq.
And then we'll be joined by Lauren Goodrich, who covers the former Soviet Union for Stratfor, and she'll be talking about the art of Kremlinology and why it's useful to understanding Russia today.
As always, if you'd like to subscribe to our free podcast feed, look us up under Stratfor on the iTunes Store. You can connect with us on Facebook or Twitter as well, where our handle is @Stratfor. Over the past few months, both the United States and Britain have announced deployments of hundreds of military trainers to Iraq, where they're preparing local troops to help fend off the Islamic State. These are obviously not the first deployments of their kind, but the intensifying commitment underscores the fact that training troops, whether in Iraq or Afghanistan, has been a notoriously challenging task for coalition forces for a number of years. So today, we'd like to explore some of the reasons that's the case. And I'm here now with not one, but two veterans who have firsthand experience in Iraq. Stratfor's military analyst Paul Floyd, a former Army Ranger who served tours in both Baghdad and Ramadi, and also my co-host Ben Sheen, who served with the British Royal Forces in the Basra sector. To start out, I'll point out that U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter recently stirred up some controversy by saying that Iraqi forces lack the will to fight Islamic State militants. This isn't exactly an isolated point of view, but in your experience, is it accurate or even valid?
I would say that it kind of misses the point because, this is a reaction. That's an emotional reaction, an emotional statement to the idea that Ramadi happened, the most recent time Ramadi. And I'm speaking of Islamic State taking over Ramadi after we've had the fall of Mosul. Supposedly, we've been putting more military power in there. The ground forces are being more competent. And then Islamic State does what they do best, which is they have they mass on a certain place and do a sudden assault, and they were able to take Ramadi. Supposedly, they took Ramadi in the face of, more Iraqi security forces on the ground, a larger military presence that they were fighting against, and they were successful. So the natural tendency is to then say, well, they're just that the Iraqi army is just screwed up. The security forces are bad. And so it's easy to say that they lack the will to fight, but I think you're overlooking, when you say that, several of the factors and the nuance of what kind of has led the Iraqi army to the state that it's in, which is the fact that it's a organization that is very young, as the current institution is. And because of that, it has no leadership, has no institutional inertia, has none of that, those things that you need that make militaries really effective. And so it is performing poorly. But to completely blame it on the lack of will to fight, it misses many of these points.
I completely agree. And you have to remember where Carter's coming from. He is going to be held accountable on some level. And the issue of accountability is important because on one side, you can say, hey, we've given Iraq billions of dollars, some of the most cutting-edge equipment, and access to some of the finest trainers in the world. Simply, why aren't you guys delivering the goods? But like Paul said, it's a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, and to a point, I would also say that he's messaging that, this is less about him being, this diagnosing the problem and more about trying to galvanize certain actions and send messaging both to the Iraqi government and several of the other actors on the ground and some of the other foreign sponsors that are also supporting the Iraqi military, namely Iran. And so to kind of unpack some of the stuff that I'm talking about, when I talk about the your army being young, most people will look at me cross-eyed when I say that and say, well, no, the Iraqi army has been around since the 16th century. They've been supporting the Ottoman Turks, and there's been a continuous line of an Iraqi military in some kind of capacity since then. But that is very true. But the fact is, militaries are constantly turning over, and this Iraqi military was completely dismantled in 2003 and has been completely restructured and rebuilt from nearly the bottom up from scratch. And that's kind of unprecedented. And building a military from the ground up is extremely hard. And I would say one of the biggest advantages any military institution has is that institutional inertia, that institutional knowledge that allows it to be successful over time, because you do have constant turnover. No single person or group of people makes a military. It's that group knowledge that makes a military successful. And because we've been restructuring this whole time, the Iraqi army is very weak because of it.
And it's funny he mentions the will to fight as well, because that's a key part of it. When you talk about cohesion, esprit de corps, and actually having that fire in your belly that compels you to go and take the fight to another person. And one of the problems we've seen endemic to the Iraqi army is widespread corruption. We've seen a lack of transparency. We've seen a lack of faith in the higher command chain and also at the political level. And these are not necessarily things that really compel your young Iraqi soldier to go and fight what's perceived, at least, as a dedicated, ruthless enemy like the Islamic State.
That describes the state of affairs today. And it's very interesting because, Paul, you've pointed out in the past that not too many years ago, Iraq had one of the most effective fighting armies in the Arab world. And, this cadre of leadership under Saddam Hussein no longer is with the Iraqi army per se because they were dismantled. That doesn't mean that their skills, their knowledge don't exist. They're simply fighting on a different side at this point.
Yeah, their skills and knowledge kind of went elsewhere when they got disbanded in 2003. A lot of them actually joined the insurgency, and there's even senior Iraqi officers who now are on the side of Islamic State. So the problem is when they fragmented, you still need to earn a wage, you still need to make some money. And these guys, they picked a side. It wasn't necessarily the side that we wanted.
The best way to look at the Iraqi military in the sense of a midterm history of it is this is an institution that was built under the Ba'athist regime. In fact, before the Ba'athist regime, it had been a military dictatorship. You have the Ba'athist regime. Saddam Hussein is in charge of this. And to a point, the Iraqi military was designed under kind of Soviet structures. This is all under the guise of the Cold War as well. And they're working with the Soviet Union and Soviet trainers to kind of build that kind of structure. And then we flow into the Iran-Iraq War, which lasts for over a decade. Is extremely trench warfare. A lot of people actually kind of liken it to World War I in many ways. Very brutal fighting, very stagnant fighting. And then roll that forward to not much later in time, you have the first Gulf War. And you have the U.S. military basically, and its coalition partners, I should be fair, completely and utterly dismantle the forces that went into Kuwait. And really, degraded the ability of the Iraqi military. And that's really where it starts to kind of go downhill with the Iraqi military, I would say, argue, for the most part. So you have that destruction in the Gulf War, and then you have this entire sanctions regime for the following decade. And that sanctions regime basically it limited resources, limited training, and it's still also I don't know if the Iraqi army ever really was able to kind of do a lessons, an after action review like you would see in some Western militaries where they kind of like lessons learned from the last fight, because there was much political jockeying. And that's the other part of this is, remember, a lot of the Iraqi military is built on tribal structures, and it's a Sunni minority tribal structures that are running the military and are just as afraid of the military and remaining in control of it as they are as making an effective military. In fact, they're much more concerned with it being under control and being less of a coup problem than they are about actually having an effective force that can go out there and maybe defend against the United States, for example. Then you get again to 2003, round two, the United States military actually invades Iraq, again dismembers what's left of it, and then disbands it completely. And to Ben's point, that's where you have a lot of the officer corps and what's remaining of this institutional knowledge in this military that's already severely degraded, now basically flowing into an insurgency and working for the Sunni tribal structure as it starts to pit itself both in a sectarian civil war and insurgency against the United States occupation forces.
Well, and I think that you touch on a really key point right there, which goes to the heart of why do people fight? Because as Americans, and I think also as a Brit, that you can understand, we have a sense of nationhood that confines around our geography to a certain extent. I mean, historically, it wasn't that way in the beginning necessarily, but we both come from areas where a nation expanded within the bounds of its geography and filled that space. And so we have a very geographic sense of identity. And that's not true everywhere in the world, where borders move or are redrawn, based on warfare and other things. And you touch on tribalism within Iraqi society. Even under Saddam, weren't the officers really fighting along tribal lines because they had a Sunni minority that was empowered, they were empowered and determined to protect?
Absolutely. And so when you think about Iraq as a nation, the sense of nationhood and fighting for nationhood, that flows back and forth. That's not a consistent thing. It's not a constant thing. And so Iraq at times, especially when you talk about Iraq fighting Iran in the Iraq-Iran war, very much had a sense of nationhood. But as all these things do, they can ebb and flow and degrade. And all this, that brief history I just gave you has kind of degraded that sense of nationhood. And in many ways, then, not that people, we always talk about Iraq and the different ethnic and sectarian lines that divide it. That wasn't something that was barely being kept in control as much as that's where people default to in many ways. It's the love of one's own and also just understanding one's own. You gravitate towards your community that you identify with, and that's what you fight for. So as Iraq as a nation was being, attacked and dismantled, rightfully or wrongly, that's where, communities started to devolve back to the structures that they understood. As Iraq itself couldn't protect itself, all of a sudden my tribal structure, my sectarian structure, my ethnicity, that's the community I could rely on. And that's how it started to evolve. And so that sense of nationhood for Iraq is devolving. And then you start to add on these ideas that you have other poles of power directly surrounding Iraq that are kind of driving these fights with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, with Turkey, and all kind of influencing these different battles throughout the region. That's kind of become a sectarian show-off to a certain degree. That further kind of exacerbates those lines and divides the nationhood that we once felt for that country.
And there's an interesting parallel here because it's not just in Iraq. It makes me think back to the recent Scottish referendum on independence. Within the British Army, which is world-renowned for its ability and professionalism, I have to get that in there, you have a number of dedicated Scottish regiments, Welsh regiments, and when it looked like Scotland might actually devolve from the Union, we had this question, what happens to the Scottish regiments? They're part of the British Army. But would Scottish soldiers all of a sudden leave and then form whatever defence force that Scotland had? And that was an interesting thought experiment because, you think of the United Kingdom as being united and having a very well-developed military. And ultimately, one of the reasons that the military is good is because of professionalism. You have well-trained, well-paid soldiers who are motivated and dedicated and well-equipped to go and conduct operations overseas. Whereas, like Paul said, a lot of that was eroded in Iraq, as well as having these sectarian divisions. You then suddenly had an officer corps, a key leadership that wasn't necessarily as engaged with the process as they should have been. You have this situation where a military grouping might have X amount of soldiers on paper, but a lot of them effectively are paid to stay at home. They give half their wages to the officer who then puts it into his pocket. So when it comes time to fight against a very rapidly evolving and dangerous foe like Islamic State, you're limited into what you can muster, and you don't necessarily have the command and control and professionalism you'd expect to be able to face up to that threat.
How does that impact warfighting strategy, on the ground when you have foot soldiers basically who are not trained or empowered to make tactical decisions for themselves? What does that do to the nature of an army?
Well, that's a very interesting, the empowerment of the lower echelons of soldiers, a very interesting debate back and forth. And really it depends on what you're working with, the tools that you're working with. In a lot of Western militaries and higher end militaries, it's easy to kind of have that, empowerment at the lower echelons on a tactical level because you can afford to do the training to kind of make that plausible and make that make sense. And that's kind of a luxury to a certain degree. A lot of countries cannot rely on that. The United States can basically have fire team leaders on the level making tactical decisions on their own or within a construct that makes sense because they can train them to do so over and over and over again. In militaries, that's an all-volunteer force. That's billions in dollars expended on defense. You pull that back and look at other militaries that are relying on conscripts and have a fraction of the defense spending that when you talk about some of these other militaries, they very much need a top-down system because the resources can't go to training at all levels. And really that's where you have these officer-led, officer-dominant systems because the officers are the small cadre. They have the resources to train heavily in warfare and competently in warfare, and everybody else has to be rigidly under them and under that control for that military to make sense and operate smoothly.
Absolutely. And to use a somewhat martial metaphor here, it's like having a knife. It's like making a good knife and honing the edge over and over again. You have a very sharp edge that it takes time to develop. The minute that you let the blade go dull, or actually you break the blade completely and you have to manufacture a new one, it takes time to get back to the level you're at before.
And money.
And money, absolutely. And that's something about established militaries. It's maintaining that edge.
From all of this, it sounds as though U.S. and Britain both have a very difficult prospect in front of them because we are in the process of reshaping an army to defend a territory where actually the borders no longer exist in the way that we're used to seeing them drawn on a map. The Islamic State has overrun. We now refer to the Iraq-Syria battle space. It's a very fluid environment, and the loyalties and the groupings of the fighters are very fluid as well.
I think it's interesting to look at, even if you look at what we're doing, the training mission right now in Iraq, it's different than what we were doing post-2003. And I say that because post-2003, we were trying to build a military that still thought of Iraq as a single entity, a single nation. And so we wanted the military to be completely inclusive, ethnically speaking, statistically speaking. And so there was this constant drive to bring both, Sunni Arabs back into the military to a certain degree and be represented, as well as bringing some of the Kurdish Peshmerga forces in to try and make a unified military that represents a unified nation. The minute the U.S. left at the end of 2011, that quickly broke down. And a lot of the de-Baathification that we saw from Prime Minister Maliki pushed a lot of these minorities that have been brought into the military, pushed them back out. And he also, again, less about the military being an effective fighting force and more about the military being loyal to him and the power structure that was in place in Baghdad at the time, in the present time, led to that patronage network, actually, that Ben was referencing earlier. It led to the appointment of officers that were not appointed because of skill, but because of loyalty. And that completely destroys the military's ability. It leads to corruption. It leads to ineffective training and therefore ineffective fighting. And that's what we've seen. And so now the U.S. is back in with its coalition partners trying to train, and we're trying to train within those aspects, probably with a little bit more a dose of reality in the sense of making an inclusive military. But we're still demanding to bring both the Kurds in some kind of capacity and play nice with them with Baghdad, and bring Sunni tribal elements in to fight Islamic State, because we think that the answer to Islamic State is with the Sunni community as a whole, and them turning kind of like the awakening moment that we saw in 2008. But it's not being done in this, kind of idealistic way it was being done in the future. And again, we're starting from scratch. It's being done in a different way, almost to a completely different concept.
And they're not training in a vacuum. Iraq is in flames. You have Islamic State running around, creating all manner of havoc. And what was interesting to see in something like the recent Decree operation, which we covered extensively on site, was actually the way that, because everyone hates Islamic State, you're seeing unusual alliances form. And at one stage in that operation, you had US aircraft in the overhead, you had Iranian IRGC guys on the ground and an advisory role, you had Sunni and Shia militias working together, and then some form of Iraqi security force presence, all working to try and get Islamic State out of that position.
The huge caveat on that is while they're working together because everyone is against Islamic State that much, because they presented themselves that much as a threat to the country, they're still working together it's very tentative, and there's still a lot of tension in these relationships. And you could easily see, this devolve at any given time with Shia militias operating in Sunni areas with potential ethnic genocide, potentially, or dislocations or what have you, reprisal attacks against the Sunni community, which would drive the Sunni community even further away from trying to deal with Islamic State. You also see conflict between Iraqi security forces and Shia militias, both between themselves. We've seen some interesting conflicts in Baghdad over some buildings and some miscommunication. And then we've also seen conflicts between Shia militias and Peshmerga. And there's an ongoing dispute between Baghdad and Erbil over places like Kirkuk.
And then add to that supposed arrogance of Iranian officers working with Iraqi security forces who take exception to that as well. So at every level, you've got friction.
Yeah, that's actually one of the interesting things that we always should point out. As much as Baghdad is having to work with Iran and turn to it, don't forget that they fought this terrible war within over a decade within recent history. And so there's still enmity to a certain degree. It's dangerous to paint this as Baghdad and the Shia community is completely working hand in hand with Iran all the time. There is self-interest operating there too.
I think that all that really begs the question of the million-dollar question is the path to success from a Western standpoint. Are we looking at this all wrong? I mean, do we possibly need to really take a hard look at what we consider to be territory that can be defended, at the communities of people that are willing to defend it? Do we need to think of Iraq in the same nation-state way that we think of ourselves? And what are the pitfalls of that?
I think you're starting to see the realistic approach now. As painful as it is, and as frustrating as it can be, you're seeing people already look at Iraq in several different ways. I mean, we've seen several U.S. politicians call out and saying that, this is de facto 3 different states. And we've actually seen Congress, when it was trying to fund the training mission recently to Iraq for this next upcoming fiscal year, they tried to push through an amendment that basically funded the Kurds outside of Baghdad and also the Sunni tribal structures as well. So that would have, again, separate funding completely out of Baghdad's purview. That's a sovereignty question and kind of de facto says that, this is a separate thing. And politics have kind of shut that down, and the White House has set on that. But yeah, people are thinking of it differently. And I think also people, as you look at how they're designing this is about protecting what is the core interests of Western interests in Iraq. And really that's basically making sure there's no and I want this is kind of in a relative sense, humanitarian disaster. I know it already is a humanitarian disaster, but make sure there's no outright genocide. And also the oil fields, protecting oil markets and those giant contributors to those oil markets, both in the KRG and down in the Shia core down south.
Well, let's not forget a lot of the problems actually originated 150 years ago when lines were drawn on a map. And the problem is it's very easy to divide land geography on a map. But actually, when you're talking about dividing societies, peoples, that's where things get really complicated.
Yeah, and I'll end with this last caveat to the whole point. Dividing Iraq completely, though, outright is not as easy as it sounds, because you have to make sustainable states if you do divide it. And making sustainable states in some of these statelets or subsections that we're talking about would be impossible, which would further exacerbate basically warfare, because people will compete over resources.
It sounds like future debates and analyses to come. All right. Thank you both so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. In this next segment, we'll be taking a look at Russia, which is a perennially interesting country. And clearly, last year and this year, there's been more stuff going on for us to really focus on. What were the challenges in Ukraine, sanctions against Russia, and then counter-sanctions back against Europe and the West, and also the drop in oil prices, which has put significant strain on the Russian economy.
Throughout all of this, it's been very interesting to watch Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Interesting, but not always easy. He actually disappeared for 10 days back in March with no explanation, and that event got Russia analysts talking and thinking about the Cold War art form known as Kremlinology.
And for more on that, let's turn to Stratfor's senior analyst for the former Soviet region, Lauren Goodrich, who wrote our most recent series on Kremlinology. Lauren, welcome.
Thank you.
So can you start by describing for maybe some listeners who weren't around during the time, exactly how Kremlinology was used during the Soviet period? What was involved with it, and why was it important?
Well, Kremlinology is pretty much an art form and could apply to the study of any country's elites or government. But Kremlinology is critical specifically for Russia because Russia's ever-changing web of alliances and rivals and influencers inside the Kremlin elite really do reflect the stability of the country and the direction of the country overall. The Kremlin is, of course, a hyper-secretive place filled with disinformation and intrigue. So during the Soviet period, it became really critical to look at these minuscule little scraps of information that could be pieced together in order to create the larger picture. Because the Kremlin never shows you what the actual picture is, so you have to take the hints and the clues.
In fact, Winston Churchill had his own opinion on Kremlinology, didn't he?
Very much so. He said it was, I'm going to misquote, of course, but along the lines of, the Kremlin is really two dogs fighting over a bone underneath a blanket, and you never know until one dog comes out with the limbs of the other who is actually on top.
And that's still true today, right?
Very much so. So in the Soviet period, Kremlinology included things like studying photographs of meetings and social events, who was standing next to who was actually in attendance. An example of this would have been when the head of the NKVD, Beria, went missing. No one knew until he didn't show up to the Bolshoi Ballet when every Kremlin elite was at the Bolshoi Ballet. What we found out later was he was already arrested and was about to be put on trial. So that's an example of using photographs of meetings and social events. Another clue is looking at where the Russian forces are. Russia doesn't easily publish where the Russian forces are, particularly in the Soviet period. So going back to the Beria example, when Beria went missing, there were some elite Russian military forces that moved from the Western Front in Germany back to Moscow. Why would they go back to Moscow? Because Khrushchev needed the military to actually stand behind him in order to arrest Beria. Another really good example for Kremlinologists is scouring Russian media. Each media has its biases and then also can be used for propaganda purposes. So during the Soviet period, the Communist Party liked to use Trud and Pravda, or the Russian military liked to use Red Star. So scouring the Russian media, you really get to figure out what the elites are actually concerned with, who they're targeting next, etc.
That's interesting because normally certain propaganda materials might be discarded because of their inherent bias. But if you know how to read them, and actually you can read between the lines and really see what the message is and who's putting it out, there's a lot you can extract from that, right?
Yeah, my favorite example is probably when Andropov was trying to get into control. He was head of the KGB at the time, and he ordered a series of pro-KGB stories throughout the Russian media that really kind of bolstered the popularity of the KGB at the time. And so Andropov used this power and this shift of pro-KGB in order to pass a whole bunch of new expansions of power for the KGB itself. That way, once Brezhnev actually passed away, he was able to jump into leading the country. So.
Was there ever a time when this wasn't a way that the Russian elite used to communicate? I mean, for instance, maybe during the Gorbachev or Yeltsin periods, was this something that ever just fell out of vogue?
Well, Kremlinology did taper off during the Gorbachev-Yeltsin periods, mainly because the West did not see Russia as the threat. However, if you look at Kremlinology and you look at all the clues that came out during Yeltsin's last few years, and you pick those apart, you can see Putin's rise, and you can see that it was inevitable that Putin was coming in. So you had Russia in a serious economic crisis, which led to regional crises across the country. There was a really big political tug-of-war between the liberals and the communists taking place, and Yeltsin's family. And then, of course, we had the Chechen crisis taking place. And so there's all these crises at once, which created a perfect storm. And the Russian public and the elites blamed Yeltsin. And so he needed to bring in order to clamp down on the country regionally, economically, politically, security-wise. And it had to be someone from the KGB FSB camp. But it needed to be a personality that wasn't so hawkish that Yeltsin himself wasn't threatened. So he thought Vladimir Putin was the perfect example of bringing someone in that was literally a little bit more open-minded FSBer than many of the other FSB KGB figures. And so he brought Putin in out of the St. Petersburg circles. What he didn't understand, what Yeltsin did not understand, is that Putin could really appeal to pretty much everyone, the liberals, the security circles, and he also proved his ability to lead on getting the country back on track regionally with the Chechen crisis, with the economic crisis. So it was almost inevitable that Putin was going to succeed. And all you had to do was look at all the little pieces and put it together. And it was pretty much obvious that Putin was going to be coming in right after Yeltsin.
But then I suppose as well, Putin was well placed to sweep in and take power. You know, he had an intelligence background. He knew a lot of secrets. He moved in the right circles, and he had the connections to actually reinforce his position once he was in, right?
He had the connections and foundation, which, I mean, the most powerful foundation you can have inside of Russia is to control the security services. But it's not an end-all be-all. I mean, Beria controlled the NKVD, and he was still ousted. So for Putin, he had to appeal to all the sides. He had to appeal to the oligarchs. He had to appeal to the liberal-minded economists and financial circles, and then he had to appeal to the super hawks of security. And that's how Putin has pretty much maintained his power over the last 15 years, is being able to balance and arbitrate between all these different groups.
So how does that leave him today? I mean, going back to the Yeltsin era, you're talking about things that have parallels. I mean, there's financial crisis in Russia, there are regional crises, there's conflict near or within, depending on where you want to draw the borders. How is Putin positioned right now, and why are you thinking again about Kremlinology?
Well, Putin is in a place that he's not used to. It's almost like he's in Yeltsin's place from 1998. The only difference is that the Russian public hasn't turned on him yet. Russia has slipped into another recession. There's more than half of the Russian regions are teetering towards bankruptcy at this moment. Many of the Russian firms are needing financial bailouts. Russia has shown a major failure in Ukraine over the past year and a half. Russia's isolated from the West and is seen as the number one enemy of the United States again for the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union. It's almost like a perfect storm of crises all happening at once again. The only difference is that Putin has not lost the love of the Russian people yet. He's still wildly popular, 86% popularity rating. This is what we need to watch next on as far as whether Putin can continue to hold on to power, is the popularity rating. The second thing we need to watch is the elites underneath him. It was very easy to manage all these different groups inside of Russia over the past 15 years when times were of plenty, when there was plenty of cash, plenty of resources, plenty of positions and powerful companies to give to the elites. This is changing. Resources are really shrinking at this moment. And so we are seeing an increased infighting among the elites. And if someone's going to take down Putin, it likely won't be the Russian people. It'll be the elites themselves turning on him.
And that seems to be reflected in the people he trusts. It appears like his inner circle is getting smaller and smaller on an almost monthly basis.
Very much so. And this is going to be critical and why we need to use Kremlinology to really see where the elites are at this moment and going forward on to see if they are going to still accept Putin as leader of the country.
As you think about how you put those clues together, do you have maybe more tools when you look at Kremlinology than you did in the past?
More tools, but more disinformation because of that. That's the catch-22 on this, is that there's so much more information because, Russia's an open country. It's not like the Soviet Union was. So there's much more media. There's the internet. It has skyrocketed inside of Russia itself. There's a lot more pictures and videos and clues to consider. However, because of that, it really does create kind of a muddled picture, much more so than in the past. It's not as clear as it used to be. Another tool which has really helped as far as our use of Kremlinology is social media. Social media wasn't around, of course, in the Soviet period. And now we have certain Russian politicians and even some of the elites underneath Putin himself that use social media like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube to really convey not only their political positions, but we can see clues on where are they? Are they even in the country? What is their mindset? What are they doing? Who are they meeting with?
And what's interesting to see is the raw nature of some of the Twitter feeds we actually get from them. There seems to be, at times, an alarming lack of filter. People will literally say what's on their mind, which is revealing, and certainly something you don't really expect always from a Western politician.
Very much so. For example, Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin is a prolific Twitter user, and he has very openly considered aggressive natures inside of Ukraine on Twitter. Someone like Chechen President Kadyrov is prolific Instagrammer, and his pictures really show his loyalty, his diehard loyalty to Putin. On Instagram, he even has stated outright that he's willing to lay down his life for Putin. And this came at a time when Putin seemed to be under siege among the elites.
And certainly I know from his Instagram account, he has a penchant for gold-plated firearms as well.
Very much so. But Kadyrov is an interesting one to consider because he has multiple agendas when it comes to his social media. Because his position inside the country is very different than other politicians because he pretty much is the king of his own region. He has his own fiefdom where he's not just a parliamentarian inside of Moscow. He has his own territory that no one else rules but him. And the entire stability of the southern region of Russia really depends on him being able to continue to rule that. So he uses social media in order to cultivate this cult around him of being the strong man, but also being a leader that the Chechen people love. He's enormously popular. To where on his Instagram, he shows sponsoring children's events or wishing people happy birthday.
Or weddings.
Yeah. But he also shows that he's the tough guy, that he can rule over Chechnya, which is a volatile place. And he's made it into this cult where he believes that he's the only one that can really rule over Chechnya and keep it this stable. At the same time, he uses his Instagram almost to kind of throw it in the FSB's face of, I'm in charge of Chechnya, you can't come into Chechnya.
And that makes him a key ally for Putin, doesn't it? And it's interesting that he actually, his allegiance is with Putin personally, not just with the Russian state or the Kremlin.
Very much so. What was interesting in December when there was a really large struggle taking place between the FSB and between the GRU over who can pretty much act inside of Ukraine. Kadyrov gathered 20,000 Chechen troops. They started chanting their loyalty to Putin, saying they would all die for Putin, and asked Putin to send them into Ukraine.
Yeah, I remember because they physically formed up in a stadium, with all their equipment and weapons ready to go. And that was a very powerful statement, a very powerful image as well.
So it started off on just Russian media and then moved to YouTube and just spread around the world and really showed that Putin has this little mini army that is at his control that doesn't fall underneath the regular Russian military or doesn't fall underneath the FSB. That's a very strong message to the elites inside of Moscow.
So going back to the situation with Putin today, and particularly, as we've seen the challenges he's facing mounting over the last few months, did you ever find out where he went for those 10 days in March?
No, but I have theories. So stepping back from my theories, let's look at the puzzle pieces going into his disappearance. You actually really have to start with the failure in Ukraine because it wasn't just a Russian failure in Ukraine. It was an FSB failure inside of Ukraine. They did not predict Maidan actually turning over the government. Russia was blindsided by this. Putin was blindsided by this. And soon after, you had Putin announcing a restructuring of the FSB. That's unheard of for someone that is an FSB member to try to do. Soon after that, there were rumors that Putin was trying to place non-FSB loyalists within the Interior Ministry, which is an FSB rival. And then you had Chechen President Kadyrov holding that rally with the 20,000 Chechen troops, really taunting the FSB that they could be the ones to go into Ukraine. So you have all these puzzle pieces that really showed the FSB versus the non-FSBers struggling back and forth. Now, things happened at lightning speed in the 4 weeks leading to and including Putin's disappearance. The FSB chief showed up in Washington, D.C. A week later, opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, which, of course, was later attributed to Chechen forces and was rumored to be connected to Kadyrov. A few days after the assassination, Kadyrov posts pictures of him and Putin laughing together and embracing. Kadyrov states on his Instagram that he's willing to lay down his life for Putin. The very next day, Putin goes missing. While Putin's missing, the arrests of the Chechens for Nemtsov's assassination takes place. The FSB has a sit-down with Kadyrov that we do not know what happened. And Kadyrov's closest ally, presidential aide Surkov, leaves the country unexpectedly. So all these puzzle pieces that by themselves just look like random events that are taking place inside of Russia. But when you string it all together, you really see a very, very clear FSB, non-FSB power struggle that centers on the GRU, Surkov, and Kadyrov, all pushing up against the FSB. So the question that comes out of his disappearance is, did Putin align too far with the non-FSB groups in which the FSB had to almost put a leash on Putin and pull him back? Because as soon as Putin comes back after his 10-day disappearing act, he acts rather strangely. There's a power struggle in which the FSB gains all these new powers inside of Russia. And then secondly, Putin starts to talk about how tired he is of being president. That is very strange for someone as strong as Putin.
And he's never expressed that sentiment any time before, has he?
No, and he really starts to reflect on all the things he's missed in his life because of being president. So it makes you wonder if he is now resigned to leaving the presidency soon, or if the FSB has made that decision for him. There's a lot of questions coming out of the disappearance and whether Putin is still fully in control of the country.
Well, so if Putin wasn't the leader of Russia, what would that state of affairs look like, and who might we be looking at instead?
It depends on if you're talking about short-term or long-term. In the short term, it has to be someone from the security services. There are too many problems affecting Russia with the economic situation, the region starting to rumble again, what is considered pretty much the enemy getting onto Russia's border. Russia's in such a delicate place at this time that you need a strong arm to come in. Now, how strong of arm to come in? I wouldn't say that someone as hawkish as someone like Dmitry Rogozin could actually come into the presidency. But there's some very pragmatic, for Russian standards, FSB people that would love to be president. Someone like Sergei Ivanov has been salivating over the presidency for 10 years. Someone like Defense Minister Shoigu, though, is incredibly popular among the people and is considered to be seen as a neutral player within Russia himself. However, he's not orthodox, so I think that would be a really big problem with the Russian people. So that's all in the short term. In the longer term, there's a lot of up-and-comers, but they all seem to be the sons and sometimes daughters of all the current Kremlin elite. So it's almost like the next generation is going to inherit this elite struggle that we're seeing take place at this time.
So going back to the Ukraine situation for just a moment, do you have any sense that the Russian people perceive Putin's handling of the Ukraine affair as a misstep?
Initially, but I think that they see it more as an FSB misstep. And the Russian government has done a dazzling job of convincing the Russian people that it was a U.S.-backed coup. And because of this, it started off to where the Russian people were almost stunned by what happened in Ukraine, and then they rallied around the presidency and around the Kremlin soon after. And that popularity is still riding high at this moment. And so at this time, it's not a failure as it was, say, a year and a half ago. Instead, it's been completely flipped and turned on its head to being a U.S. versus Russia issue.
But as you look at the situation with the federal budget, defense spending is one area that isn't being cut as a result of the crisis with oil prices. If there is a reduction in pension payouts, would that change that situation?
It could start. However, there was an interesting poll that came out of Levada in which the Russian people said that they would rather have a decrease in their own salaries than cut defense spending. I mean, that really shows the Russian people's rallying around the government and hypersensitivity to anything that's happening between Russia and the West at this time.
And there is that dynamic that, they are living in dangerous times, especially on the wake of the US-Iran deal. And for a long time, Iran seemed to occupy a lot of the US's focus. And traditionally, Russia has seen the US as a great adversary. But with Washington being tied down, in the Middle East, focusing on Iran. Now that when that goes away, do you think Russia feels potentially more threatened that the US is going to have more resources to potentially counter Russia in whatever way they can?
Very much so. Russia is pretty much losing one of its only cards against the United States, Iran. Russia doesn't have many tools to really counter the United States, and any tools that it can use, such as military buildups, missile deployments, are very expensive. Russia doesn't have the extra cash to have an arms race like it did in the past. I think this is why we've seen a little bit of a hedging coming out of certain Kremlin officials, such as Sergei Ivanov, in which he said, we don't want war with the United States. We're not suicidal. They know that there is a limit to their ability to stand up to the United States. However, they do see the United States and the West as their biggest enemy and threat at this time, even though really their biggest threat is internally inside of Russia.
Well, this is definitely going to be one that's high on our radar for quite some time to come, I believe. So, Lauren, thank you very much for making the time today.
Thanks.
Before we leave you today, we'll take a quick peek inside the Stratfor Mailbag. As our listeners know, we've been asking you to send us questions, feedback, and ideas for future podcasts at www.stratfor.com/podcast/feedback. And some of you did. Here's one from a new subscriber, Patrick Bucher, in Lucerne, Switzerland. He's been looking for comprehensive analysis on what he calls a crucial point and asks, to what extent are Russian forces engaged in the combat in eastern Ukraine? Is Russia sending weaponry or other military equipment to the region, and is it possible to do so without being detected by U.S. surveillance? He also wants to know if Russia is supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine with military advisors or more actively on the battlefield. Here's one of Stratfor's military analysts, Sim Tak, with the response.
Actually, throughout the conflict in eastern Ukraine, we've very clearly seen the Russian involvement there. We haven't even required U.S. satellites or any of those fancy sensors to be able to know that they are there. From the ground in eastern Ukraine, we've seen photographs, we've seen video, all showing military personnel that clearly shows the behavior of the Russian military. We've been able to identify specific types of equipment, specific main battle tanks, armored vehicles that were not present in the Ukrainian military, but do exist in the Russian military. And then on top of that, Russian troops inside eastern Ukraine have actually been exercising very poor operational security. These troops have been posting pictures of themselves in clearly recognizable areas of eastern Ukraine, while also simply posting geotag statements to Russian social media sites. The Russian military has been trying to crack down on that, but from time to time, soldiers keep doing this, basically confirming to us that they are still operating there. We initially saw the Russian involvement ramp up shortly after the downing of the MH17 aircraft. At that point, the Russians gradually started increasing their presence until right before the initial Minsk agreement. They got to a level of about 12 to 16 battalion-sized units operating in diverse areas of eastern Ukraine. 12 to 16 battalions translates to approximately 8,000 to 10,000 troops, which is pretty much in line with the estimates that we've seen coming out of Ukrainian intelligence services and US and NATO statements.
Once again, that was military analyst Sim Tak, and thanks again to Mr. Bucher and Lucerne for that question. If you have questions or comments to share, please drop us a line at stratfor.com/podcast/feedback.
Be sure to give us your full name and an idea of how to pronounce it, as well as the city and the country you're writing from.
That's it for today. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, for more in-depth analysis and forecasts on global issues, please visit stratfor.com.